Another device employed by government mandarins who serve as lackeys for the 1% is information overload. If they do eventually weaken and loosen their grip on their precious files, they often resort to making available mountainous quantities of data and reports, very little of which is of any real interest or value, so that anything that might be truly useful is all but impossible to find. 20 years ago, Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky published their seminal work on the subject of how our media is manipulated, Manufacturing Consent. Although this magnificent book applies mostly to the American media, it is entirely relevant to the British media too, because all things American are held up to be true models of perfection for the 99% to copy. Here in the UK, we are blessed with a very excellent Media Lens, a website run on a shoestring budget, which is committed to providing superb professional analysis of the so-called news, with which we are spoon-fed 24/7. The two books, Guardians of Power and Newspeak in the 21st Century, are by David Edwards and David Cromwell, the co-editors of Media Lens, and they're crushing indictments of the British media and the role it plays in spreading lies and deceit to help facilitate elitist control of our lives. Valuable sources such as Knightley's great book, together with Manufacturing Consent and Media Lens, provide evidence that could reasonably be called irrefutable of the careful and deliberate manipulation of our media by governments and corporations alike. It stands to reason that if the media, serving as our eyes and ears to the world, are routinely distorting the sights and sounds we see and hear, then our understanding of our world is at best a fantasy, and at worst a cynical lie. And if this intentional falsification of events were not enough to confuse and mislead us, there is the added weight of the law to contend with, especially the libel laws. Britain is reckoned to have the most savage and repressive libel laws in the world. The fine journalist George Monbiot wrote the following, and I quote, "Yesterday, two men with whom I seldom agree, the US Senators Arlen Specter and Joe Lieberman, launched a new bill called the Free Speech Protection Act to defend US citizens against English libel law. Our laws, they argue, threaten the free-flowing marketplace of ideas, which enables the ideals of democracy to defeat the totalitarian vision of Al-Qaeda and other terrorist organizations. English libel law is an international menace, a national disgrace, a pre-democratic anachronism. It defends crooks, terrorists and tyrants from investigation. It threatens the free speech of people all over the world and causes untold damage to the reputation of this country. And neither the British government nor the British Parliament gives a damn." Another fine investigative journalist, Greg Palast, added his weight to the argument, and I quote, "Britain has become the libel suit capital of the world. Stories accepted elsewhere draw steep judgments in London. The Guardian papers receive a notice of legal actions about 3 times a day. That's 1,000 libel notices a year. And no one in their right mind would call The Guardian a radical publication." The great John Pilger also agrees, I quote, "In Britain, free-minded journalists might turn their attention to the repeal of legislation passed since 1979, which restricts and intimidates the right to report openly and without fear or favour. The 1981 Contempt of Court Act, the 1986 Police and Criminal Evidence Act, and the 1994 Criminal Justice Act. Any authoritarian regime would be delighted to have these on its statute books. The libel law should be abolished too, or rewritten to provide a free service for ordinary people seeking redress." The depth of the cynicism that applies in Britain to controlling the information we receive is truly quite breathtaking. Even those elements of the media which loudly proclaim balance and impartiality are in fact frequently guilty of producing very biased information for various reasons. Sometimes the reasons are quite sinister, such as the incestuous relationship between the BBC and the secret services that most likely survives to this day. For example, British intelligence officers routinely vetted the applications for editorial jobs in the BBC for over 40 years, and would no doubt still openly be doing so if The Guardian had not exposed the practice in 1985. Respected journalists such as John Snow and John Simpson both described in their autobiographies how, as fresh-faced young journalists, they were offered jobs with MI5, at the start of their careers. And John Pilger once described how Sandy Gall, the ITN reporter and newsreader, boasted of his work for MI6 in Afghanistan during the 1980s, and his liaison meetings with MI6 officers at Stone's Chop House in Piccadilly. And Seamus Milne, a very well-known investigative journalist on The Guardian, wrote this, I quote, "After US Senate hearings in 1975 revealed the extent of CIA recruitment of both American and British journalists, sources let it be known that half the foreign staff of a British daily were on the MI6 payroll." CIA subversion of the media started almost as soon as that evil organisation was born. Tim Weiner, writing in his authoritative history of the CIA, wrote this, and I quote, "From his first days in power in the early 1950s, Alan Dulles, who was chief of covert operations, polished the public image of the CIA, cultivating America's most powerful publishers, broadcasters, and courting newspaper columnists. Dulles kept in close touch with the men who ran the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the nation's leading weekly magazines. He could pick up the phone and edit a breaking story, or make sure an irritating foreign correspondent was yanked from the field. It was second nature for Dulles to plant stories in the press. The men who responded to the CIA's call included Henry Luce, the millionaire publisher, and his editors at Time, Life, and Fortune, popular magazines such as Parade, the Saturday Review, and Reader's Digest. What Dulles had started soon became standard practice. The writer William Bloom continues the story. Another Italian newspaper, the Daily American of Rome, for decades the country's leading English language paper, was for a long period in the 1950s to the 1970s partly owned and or managed by the CIA. We had at least one newspaper in every foreign capital at any given time, the CIA admitted in 1977, referring to papers owned outright or heavily subsidized or infiltrated sufficiently to have stories printed which were useful to the agency, or to suppress those it found detrimental. But the company didn't limit its journalistic ambitions to newspapers. One might be forgiven for thinking that Radio Free Europe, the radio station that was highly active in the 1950s, was an entirely European organisation. Not quite. Here's Tim Weiner again, describing Radio Free Europe, the CIA's $100 million media machine. More than 3,000 emigre broadcasters, writers and engineers and their American overseers put the radio on the air in 8 languages, filling the airwaves up to 19 hours a day. And remember, that was in the 1950s, when $100 million was quite a lot of money. CIA involvement in our media was still alive and well at the dawn of the new millennium. An interesting report by F. William Engdahl in 2010 revealed that the independent-sounding Reporters Without Borders was significantly influenced by the US government. According to RWB's website, they have been fighting for press freedom on a daily basis since 1985. It does this, according to their website, by supporting journalists working in dangerous places. Although linked to Washington, RWB appears to be headquartered in Paris, but is present in all 5 continents. A much tried and tested technique used by investigative journalists is to follow the money. Understanding how people and organizations are funded is an excellent way of learning their real purpose. According to RWB's website, the organization funds itself by the sale of its twice-annual albums of photographs. But an attempt to go on the RWB website to order any of their publications found no link to any purchasing information, nor any price listing or book summary. Further digging by Mr. Engdahl revealed that, after years of trying to hide it, the Paris-based Secretary General of RWB confessed that the RWB budget was primarily funded by US organizations strictly linked to US foreign policy, such as USAID and NED, both of which have been known front organizations for the CIA. RWB seemed to be rather coy about their funding, and as one researcher found after months of trying to get a reply from NED about their funding of Reporters Without Borders, which included a flat denial from RWB Executive Director Lucy Morillon, the NED revealed that RWB received grants over at least 3 years from the International Republican Institute, which is one of 4 subsidiaries of NED, itself a subsidiary of the CIA. A brief study of RWB's own website and the remarkable conformity of its interests with those of US foreign policy pretty much joins up the dots. And British journalist Robert Fisk wrote the following account about the 6-year imprisonment at Guantanamo Bay of Sami al-Hajj, a journalist for Al Jazeera. From the moment Sami al-Hajj arrived at Guantanamo, flown there from the brutal US prison camp at Kandahar, his captors demanded that he work for them. The cruelty visited upon him, constantly interrupted by American admissions of his innocence, seemed designed to turn al-Hajj into a US intelligence asset. "We know you are innocent. You are here by mistake," he says he was told in more than 200 interrogations. "All they wanted was for me to be a spy for them. They said they would give me US citizenship, that my wife and child could live in America, that they would protect me. But I said I will not do this, first of all because I'm a journalist and this is not my job, and because I fear for myself and my family." It's not unreasonable to wonder exactly what services these American interrogators had in mind for a journalist. What exactly did they want him to do? The true extent of the involvement of the so-called intelligence community with those we trust to supply us with information about what's happening in the world can of course only be guessed at. But as I've tried to show, it's obviously very considerable. We know that these people routinely control a significant amount of our so-called news, such that our understanding of the world is not how things actually are, but how the so-called intelligence community want us to see and understand them. But this is far from being the only difficulty we have in trying to really understand the world around us.